Thanks so much, Christoph. That was a really fantastic way to set the scene and raised a host of interesting questions that I'm excited for our panel to talk about so I can hear what they have to say. So if I can invite them to come up now, Javier, Nick Butler, and Michael Liebrecht. You have all the bios, so we're behind on time, so I won't introduce everyone. You can just read them. Our moderator is Javier Blas. You have his bio as well, so I won't introduce him except to say that the FT and his work really set the standard for commodity reporting. Recently, I think you were the victim of a cyber attack, and my FT Energy Twitter feed went down for 5 days, and I was emailing Ed Crook in New York, going, "Well, I don't know what I need to know. Where is it? Tell me what I'm missing." So that's how indispensable your work has become, at least to me. So thank you very much for being here, and thanks to all the panelists.
Thank you very much, Jason, and thank you very much, Columbia University, for the kind invitation. Sorry about the Twitter feed. We have restored. We can't blame. We have tracked to Syria the attack. So apologies for that. The energy, the Twitter feed is back. I'm going to just go very briefly on the panelists, but you have the bios on your booklets. But just very, very briefly say Michael Liebrecht is the chief executive of Bloomberg New Energy Finance. He has been working on the company since, if I'm not mistaken, 2004 with a staff of 200 people. And very interestingly, it's not that it's all Bloomberg New Energy Finance obviously is providing information for people who are interested in new energy, particularly green forms of energy. But he has a fantastic engineering background from the University of Cambridge, where he was the winner of a very prestigious prize, the Ricardo Prize for thermodynamics, and that was very, very interesting on that piece of information on his bio. Nick Butler, who didn't suffer, you didn't suffer the cyber attack on your blog on the Financial Times.
No, not as bad.
Nick is, we are very, very pleased that he is contributing to the Financial Times with a blog on energy issues, but obviously you know him much better for his fantastic work at BP, where he was Group Vice President in charge of strategy. Later he was down in the street as a senior policy advisor, and more recently he is the chair of King's College in London Policy Institute, and you know about Christoph. So, it was very interesting, your presentation, because you were painting a world where Saudi Arabia should be very worried about the next, in particular, the next 10 years. And I was in Vienna last week for the OPEC meeting, and we have this ritual that is a real pain for me. You could say that I'm not a particularly sporty guy, but we go jogging with Minister Naimi of Saudi Arabia the morning before the OPEC meeting. He really enjoyed taking the press corps, and as my girlfriend usually says, Minister Naimi is the only reason you get out of bed at 6 o'clock in the morning for a jog of 45 minutes. And I asked Minister Naimi, how worried are you about shale? And he looked to me, first of all, he kind of mentioned something that I needed to skip breakfast after the jogging. And then he said, we are fine and relaxed. We welcome shale. It's not a problem for us. But why the Saudis are so relaxed about shale oil?
You are the second journalist who tells me about this morning jogging section.
We are all predictable, sorry.
If I ever become oil minister, that's one thing I probably will not do. I don't know, what would you have said in his position? I do think that, as I said, the order of magnitude which we have in mind is such that it will require adjustments from OPEC. If the positive, those who are more optimistic on the outcasts are right, then it will require even more dramatic adjustment. And we have seen the beginnings of this. I mean, from many perspectives, the real question is, why are oil prices still where they are today? And the short answer is because we had big supply disruptions. Libya in 2011, Iran in 2012, Saudi Arabia responding responsibly and producing a lot more, and then starting at the end of next year trying to cut back that production increase, and that is likely to continue.
But one question that Minister Naimi told us was before shale existed, or before shale became widespread, and before even the global economic crisis in 2008, he was saying Saudi Aramco was exporting to the United States about 1.4 million barrels a day. He said today we are still exporting 1.4 million barrels a day.
Yeah, and Saudi Arabia has a proud tradition of making bilateral deals for oil export, and I don't see that changing in the near future. What we do see on a more serious note already is exports being redirected. Last year, oil imports in the U.S. declined by around 900,000 barrels per day, mostly at the expense of North African production and also West African production. The reason for this is that what is produced in Africa is also light sweet crude, similar to the tight oil it replaces.
Nick, on that matter, this is a revolution. The shale revolution will have very different impact on OPEC members. If you are in West Africa, that's the ones that they are really suffering.
Well, first of all, I draw two conclusions from the discussion we've had so far before I come to answer your question
Please.
directly. First of all, that I'm very sorry that Christoph isn't the energy minister in the UK.
Then you would get back into PP.
And secondly, how much dynamic change there is in the whole sector. And if I disagree at all, if I dare disagree with Christoph's excellent presentation, it is that I think he understates the degree of change that is going to come in the future. In my ill-spent youth in BP, I did work on the stats review and the annual energy outlook that the company produces, and I very sadly have a collection of them going a long way back. I did look at this, and I didn't have to go back further than 2007 to find one of those outlooks that absolutely did not mention shale gas. We did not think at that time that anything material was going to be possible. And I think you are understating now the potential for shale gas and tight oil and other forms of change in the sector, greater energy efficiency, smart grids, gas hydrates, many, many things, including things that we probably can't imagine now, that are going to impact this. So I think there is a great danger of staying in this world where energy is defined around language about scarcity and dependence and ever-rising costs, when I think the reality, which will hit OPEC as well as the companies that are over-investing in high-cost projects, the reality is of a much more diverse production system, much more efficient use of energy right across the world, people leapfrogging technology rather than waiting to catch up with it. And I think we're moving into an age of plenty rather than an age of scarcity. And that will hit and change the calculations and the economic thinking of every player in the industry.
Michael, one of the impacts of shale is that suddenly we have all got very excited about hydrocarbons once again. What that means for new forms of energy?
Interestingly enough, new forms of energy have not gone away because there is a discussion about hydrocarbons, which of course has sort of dominated the airwaves somewhat. Just to put it in perspective, investment in clean energy, so renewable energy, energy efficiency and so on, dropped for the first time in 2012. But it dropped by 11 or 12%, and it's still $250 billion. And particularly when you look at the electrical system, the investment on the supply side, so generating capacity and renewable energy, is actually globally not that far behind investment in fossil fuels. You would think it should only be gas, given the sort of the news flow. But in fact, worldwide, it's about 40-45% renewable energy. And then Europe, of course, it's it's far more than 50%. It's into the sort of 60-70%. But I want to actually, we've had sort of uncertainty, and then we've had, no, it's going to be worse than that, it's going to be more uncertain than that. And I think that it's going to be more uncertain even than that. Using my thermodynamics prize, I will now solve the Gibbs function for the future of the world's energy system in public here. But I think that there is also a bigger context to all of this discussion, because in a way, yes, there is the new technology of shale, of tight oil and shale gas, but analyzing that, as Nick says, within the framework of scarcity or plenty, or even with the geopolitical framework of what does Saudi Arabia do, what we've got is a phase change. There is a revolution going on in the whole energy system, electrical system, and the transport system, which are, of course, becoming linked in very interesting and new ways. And I think it's a very, what we do is we predict things. And a month ago in New York at our summit, I predicted with great certainty the three things that would be of greatest importance, which would be unconventional oil and gas, would be increases in energy efficiency or in energy intensity, which have been very dramatic already and will continue. So I predicted they'll continue. And the third thing is very low cost renewable energy, clean energy, and also the lowering of cost of integrating intermittent energy, which is not constant, which will also continue to drop. And the fourth thing that I predicted is that actually the future of the energy system can't be predicted because we're in this phase change period, which is discontinuous, and therefore is going to be an extremely volatile place to be trying to place capital and make financial bets.
Nick, you have been working on private sector. You have also done a lot of work in the public sector. I want to take your public sector side. What all of these shale revolution, this uncertainty that we have on where the energy market is moving, what is the impact in Europe, and in particular if there is such a thing as a European energy policy?
There's no European energy policy, and I think there are attempts to create one, which are very legitimate and honest, but they have not yet succeeded. Every country is pursuing its own energy policy, which is related to its own natural resource base, its own domestic politics, its own objectives. And I think that will continue. I don't see a really coherent policy coming out of that at the moment. I think politicians are generally now struggling by trying to meet at one and the same time three different objectives. One is security of supply, because if the lights go out, a government is in trouble. They're blamed whether it's actually their fault or not. Climate change, where they have made commitments to make reductions in the context of the approach march to a global deal, which was aimed for in 2009 but has not happened. And so you now have them they find themselves, countries such as the UK, which are very law-abiding and stick to the rules and stick to objectives that they've agreed to, now find themselves on this path towards cutting emissions when very few other people are doing that. And the third element that they're now trying to get hold of is competitiveness. And there's a new and large-scale exercise across Whitehall, which was started 2 weeks ago, I believe, on the impact of relative energy prices, particularly relatively low prices in the US, on business here and in Europe. And that has not finished yet. I look forward to reading it. I hope it's released under freedom of information, because I think it will show the large gap that is opening up. And I think that politicians trying to keep these three balls in the air are running into real difficulty, because now the science, the technology, everything that Michael talks about, which I agree with, is now making it very, very difficult for public policy to work in a very planned way.
Christophe, on this area of the impact in Europe and policy making in Europe, and you mentioned on your fantastic presentation that actually shale or tar, unconventional oil, did develop in the United States and Canada, but there are reserves elsewhere. You mentioned Venezuela, you mentioned also Russia. What is the situation? What is the outlook for unconventional oil and gas here in Europe?
Depends whether you define Russia as part of Europe.
Well, let's do it from the Urals to the west.
It is difficult because in the European Union, in that respect, there is no unanimous policy. That is true, and so you see countries struggling and you see this division, as I said, with some Eastern countries being very interested for obvious reasons in exploiting that situation, that these new supplies, and others being much more careful for environmental reasons. But if I'm the realist in this round, so let me say two things. One is with respect to European energy policies, it does exist in parts, and where it exists, unfortunately, it's very contradictory. So what we have seen is, for example, the attempt at giving Europe a carbon price. It was done in the right way. You define a volume target, and then you hope that there will be positive price for the permits to pollute. But it wasn't good enough, so the European Union also had to give itself renewable targets, and on top of that, efficiency targets. And as a result, this volume target initially was never in danger of being reached, and therefore the carbon price dropped to below any meaning. Why do I say this? Why is it important? Because now we have a situation that all of a sudden coal, which is being crowded out in the US by cheaper shale gas, is being exported and goes into Europe. Right? So you have this situation, and also, by the way, in the UK, where you have mandated requirements for renewables eating into natural gas as a supply for power generation on one hand, and cheap coal imports eating into it from the other hand. Just an example of how the best can be the enemy of the good in this respect. And I don't dare to imagine how a unified policy for access for shale resources would look like in Europe against that track record.
But it is beyond the politics of shale. It's any other business problems to develop. I mean, the U.S. have the right ownership system of the reserves, probably has a very good oil industry with the oil service industry in place. Is that an impediment or a handicap,
Yes.
or that just all could be resolved?
No, I think in Europe we are still very far away from this, even if we didn't if we had a unified, sensible policy. This is tremendously infrastructure intensive. There's a very high drilling intensity. It happened also in the US and Canada because there they have drilling rigs en masse. In Europe, you don't have this infrastructure, you don't have the pipeline network, you don't have the rigs which could do all of this. But having them, of course, in the US is itself the consequence of a competitive environment. It is also, the geology is difficult. We had the first disappointments in drillings in Germany and in Poland where it was attempted. This is not the kind of thing where all of a sudden you take the technology of the US like a key and you open a door in China or in Europe. That's not how it works. It will have to be adapted and readjusted. And so for the foreseeable future, I think even under the best of circumstances, that will take very much time in coming, will be slow in coming.
Michael, I want to go with one thing that Christoph was mentioning is the where is and what it means for climate change policy in Europe. Particularly, do you see any future on the ETS system, on the European trading system of carbon credits?
Well, technically there is a future because until there's a decision not to have
you
a future.
You are the optimist.
Well, no, a future. I didn't say it would be a future of an Elysian future of lovely high carbon prices, which is what you may want me to say.
It's a future without a price, so we know what that means.
I mean, thinking about European energy policy, it's hard to imagine executing worse than has been executed. I mean, and Christoph has said the problem with the EU ETS, setting a volume target, and then first of all having a huge recession, having a system that can't respond to that. So there's no relativity in the target based on your economic growth, and then instituting large-scale conflicting policies. And then, trying the most recent attempt, which is called backloading, where you withhold some of the sales of carbon credits to release them at a later date, which is simple. It's simply political interference. So, if they want to have a system which is based on a physical limit, but then letting the price be what it might, then that's what they have to do. And if they want to have a system where they intervene to create a price, then that's what you have to do. And that means, one of them looks like, if you want to have a price, then you have to manage it like a currency. It's an entirely artificial instrument that has to be managed with all the seriousness of a proper currency. And if you want to have a system that is really a volume-controlled system, then we have another very good example of that, and it's called Bitcoin.
Nick, I wanted to go back to Christoph's comment on shale in Europe. I'm not as pessimistic as that. I think you should remember that the shale industry is quite new and that there is a learning curve which you see in the US in terms of the costs of seismic, the quality of the seismic, footprints that are required, the basic technology, the water management, the infrastructure development, and I think you will see a simplification and actually an improvement in the process as this business starts in Europe. Now, I don't think it will occur everywhere for political reasons. I don't think it'll occur in Germany very soon, and I'm pretty sure that despite the extensive tight oil resources north of Paris, I don't see it occurring in France either. But don't forget that Europe trades energy, even if not everybody produces it. I was struck when I was in Germany last year to learn that although the Germans have said no more nuclear, when there's a peak demand, they still manage to import electricity which is nuclear produced from France and the Czech Republic. And I think that even if shale is not produced in Germany and other countries, there will be shale origin, gas and electricity produced through shale, which will get right across the European market and will influence all the other parts of the market.
Minister Fallon made on his speech a remark about how important it is that we have open trade for energy. Then Jason pressed him a bit about the situation with exports from the United States, and he was very, very cautious. But and you were mentioning this report or this review that Westminster is doing, Whitehall is doing, about the impact of different and the price gap between the United States and Europe for our competitiveness. Do you think, and looking at this question in a panel organized by Columbia University and American University, but here in London, do you think that Europe should be complaining to Washington very loudly and going to the WTO and say, I'm sorry, but gentlemen, you need to export gas, no restrictions, and please do export crude oil because you are restricting trade? Christoph?
I think to some extent, I believe in free trade, and it's true. It's actually one of the biggest accomplishments of Europe to have this unified electricity market, which is very beneficial to have for the Germans not to get too much into subsidies. It's a different matter. But I think Europe has already spoken on this issue because Maria van der Hoeven, the chief of the IEA, has stated in public that it would not be appropriate for the US to restrict exports of crude. I mean, this is an old regulation from the 30s, and I understand refineries are getting a good deal of it because you're not allowed to export crude, but you are allowed to export products such as gasoline, so they get the cheap American crude and sell it at world market prices abroad. So yes, I think we should allow for that.
I agree that we should, although I think that the question has been invested with overly much importance in the recent debate. I mean, first of all, when you say should Europe complain, the permits that are currently under discussion only relate to countries for which which are not covered by most favoured nation status. So, in fact, for Europe, those exports of natural gas, that's not in question.
Yeah, but there is a ban on crude oil, or a de facto
there is a ban on
crude oil.
There is a ban on crude oil, but oil is a much more fungible market where the only number in a way that matters is how much headroom there is or isn't globally. And that's not as simple as that. Obviously, I would hesitate to comment on crude oil economics in the presence of BP's chief economist. But I think that the point about this that is also the question of costs. Even if you allow free export of US shale gas, the question is, at the moment you've got a situation where US gas is $4 per MMBTU, in Europe it's 10 or 12, and in Asia it's 15 or 18. And the question is really, even if you allow exports, what will happen to those price relativities? And by the way, even if you allow and you accelerate, as I think you should, the exploration for shale gas here in the UK, there's a huge discussion because there's this enormous gap that has opened up between sort of fact and the political discourse about what prices we're likely to see. So we're quite clearly, in our view, we're not going to see prices of $4 per MMBTU in the UK. There's this sort of the gift from God narrative of some of the politicians. It's just absurd, and it could potentially waste us 5 years of rational energy policy whilst we believe that if we do allow fracking, and I absolutely, I think we should. My gas team has done quite a lot of work on what cost we might see in the UK for shale gas. And we're looking at $7 to $12 per MMBTU. So then you've got US gas, which you can export, but it costs, you'll have that at 4 or 5, maybe 5.5, 6, who knows. Then you have a cost of importing it to Europe, which will be another $3-4, and you'll have a price here of $8 or $9 and a competitiveness issue. And so, I think that we've got to not overestimate what the role that exports could anyway play in changing that dynamic. And then over in Asia, you're most likely to see higher prices maintained as well. So,
I agree. I'd put it a slightly different way. I think there's much too much emphasis on the US export decisions. I think the biggest impact on the market is that the US is not importing. So that the flows of gas, say from Trinidad or North Africa or elsewhere, which everybody used to assume would go into the US, are now coming into Europe. Also because we've had this decade of high prices, which Christoph showed us, a lot of money has gone into the sector, so people have found quite a lot of gas. East Africa, the Eastern Mediterranean, offshore India, offshore Brazil, all those are now under development, and Australia. And some of them look quite expensive, but the money's going in, and the developments are likely, in most cases, to be completed. That is going to increase the supply when the US is now pretty much a self-sufficient market. Where is that going to go? It's going to go into Asia and into Europe, and that is where the price effect will be felt.
I just want to come on that point. Although we've got this sort of unexpected either source of supply or direction of supply, you've also got unexpected demand. I'm thinking of post-Fukushima, you have the world's third largest economy stepping out of 20%, 30% of its energy source. So you have Germany exiting nuclear, you've got enormous growth in China, enormous growth in India. So what you've got is a world that's awash with supply, but it's also awash with demand.
Right.
Nick, you were mentioning something there of the high-cost producers in Australia, how some of those projects are not looking that pretty any longer. And previously you made a comment that some companies may be investing on the wrong projects, very expensive projects. Do you think that we have been on a rising tide environment where high prices were kind of keeping everyone looking swimming, and now the tide is beginning to recede, and some oil or gas companies are going to look like they lost their clothes?
Well, I think
I was trying to avoid naked.
An awful lot of companies sit in their boardrooms and look at that nice graph that Christoph showed of all the prices rising over the last 5 years. They read forecasts from people like Goldman Sachs, who, for whatever reason, think it's going to go to $200 a barrel, and that all gas prices are going to meet at the sort of Asian market price level. And they think then we can invest in anything and everything. And that is why I think too many people have gone to the Arctic. Too many people are going to very deep water in areas where the costs are just going up and up and up. And if my view is right, and I think the consensus view so far is that these prices are now going to at least plateau, and in some cases could come down. And that will leave people with projects that require prices of $100 a barrel or the equivalent or more, and they're looking a bit stranded. And that is why, actually, I think the international oil companies, despite the recent upturn in the stock market, are now 30% lower in value than they should be.
Well, there's at least one company who listens to a different story in the boardroom. So that's what to buy. But I think there's an important, a serious issue here also worth being mentioned when you talk about prices and the potential for them coming down sharply, which may be one of the reasons why your jogging partner was relaxed, and which also may be one of the reasons why I'm not quite so gung-ho as Nick in saying everything changes tomorrow. When oil prices collapsed in the 1980s, at least two things were markedly different from what we have today, other than OPEC coherence. One is that in the 1980s, demand was actually falling, while now consensus would have it that because of this rapid rise of non-OECD economies, demand is likely to slow but continue. And the other and more important one is again in the nature of this new resource. In the 1980s, the oil supplies that were coming on were largely the North Sea and Alaska, similar in size. But the companies running them actually faced an almost binary choice when prices crashed. They could keep production running or they could cut it. There was very little scalability of that. And most of them decided, because of the large sunk cost, to keep it running. It is different for tight oil, and we see how different it is for shale gas now because of the immense drilling intensity. You can actually, this is a scalable supply. In response to falling prices, you can scale back production. We are seeing this right now in shale gas when prices have undershot. Production now, for the first time, I think this quarter, first quarter of this year, actually fell. Production increase turned negative in response to these very low prices and simply by having rigs migrated over to the oil sector. That is possible also in the case of oil. Now, it is true, simplification sets in, standardization sets in, prices come down very rapidly, and depending whom you listen to, the price now for tight oil in the US is somewhere between $40 and $60 per barrel. But it's certainly, you would see a reaction if global prices would get anywhere near there.
I do agree that all this won't happen tomorrow. These are quite medium-term trends. They're not instant processes. And I'm not saying that prices will come down to $40 or even $60 a barrel. I just think they will. They've reached a plateau and will come down more. They're more likely to come down than go up. And I think that where we perhaps disagree, Christoph, is you have confidence in the ability of Saudi Arabia to manage the market, which I have lost because I am not sure now that given the very rapid rise in domestic demand in Saudi Arabia with a growing population and everybody having cars and using gasoline at very, very low subsidized prices, which they find it difficult to stop that system. I think now that the flexibility that they have, given their need for revenue in cutting back production, is much less than it used to be.
Okay. But that's the revenue maximizing strategy for them when you look at current prices and Saudi production costs. It is to cut rather than not to cut. I mean, your guess is as good as mine. This is an area which we cannot know. But this is exactly this is exactly where the debate needs to advance.
Colombia should
why we need these kind of energy centers, because when you read the newspapers, most people don't put the finger at this point, and it is indeed the crucial point.
Yes.
Well, I look forward for Colombia to produce more.
One of the key differences between the last time in the 80s and now is that the cost of production in Saudi Arabia has changed. If you include the social costs of production in Saudi, which then you get to the point where their budget break-even is something like $80–85 now. So how do they shut the spigots off and ensure social cohesion? Because I think in terms of the uncertainties, we've also not talked about social uncertainties.
There are some
candidates.
candidates.
We've learned something over the last 3 years, that there's really unpredictable stuff out there, not just in some of the regions, the oil-producing regions, the Middle East, but even here domestically. How do we know how the debate about shale gas will play out really in Europe? How do we know how it'll play out in the US? What will happen with the divestment movement? These are really big unknowables. So I think anybody who paints this kind of even a gently positive or a slightly gently negative picture, I think that's a really risky business to be in.
I thought you said you were super positive a few minutes ago.
We have a couple of questions from the audience, and we have literally 3 minutes to go. But Christoph, it's a question for you. How much do U.S. coal exports, that they are at the moment at record level, lower global prices for thermal coal, and that in turn is increasing coal demand worldwide? Or is U.S. exports of thermal coal crowding out other coal sources worldwide, meaning probably South Africa, Russia, Australia?
So what we have seen is that coal demand, again, we will publish the numbers on the 12th of June, so I have to be very careful or my colleagues will crucify me. We have seen coal being a very fast-growing fuel. And what happens, it does crowd out natural gas in some places. And it's not only exports from the US which have gone up, it is also Russia which is benefiting there on the coal side and losing out On the gas side, another example of a large company denying the significance of shale gas for the longest time and now getting punished from an unexpected corner. If you allow me just one clarification, I think is also important for this debate. Yes, there are some countries who desperately need the revenues, some oil-producing countries, but some of them, including the one you mentioned, have huge financial reserves and have been known to run deficits for years in the past. So again, it's more complicated than just the simple cut-off saying they need so much for their budget. I hear this all the time. It's more complicated.
$400 billion in the Saudi Arabia treasury. I think that they will just allow them for a couple of years on low prices.
You have better jogging partner friends than me. I don't know how much is in there.
Michael, a question that is very much on the front page of the newspapers is solar panels and China tariffs. What do you think that the US and the UK should be doing about this?
The US and the UK. Well, first of all, I think if you look at all of the clean energy technologies, solar amongst them, but also others, the most important thing for those industries is to drive down their costs. And you do that by using the best technology and the best supply chain. And by the way, a message to those economists who think we shouldn't be doing clean energy because first we have to kind of sit in the laboratory. We have to get to scale, and we have to get low financing costs as well. So you have to use the best financing technology too. And so in that context, if you look at those trade tensions, they are entirely unhelpful, not just for the clean energy industry, but also for broader policy goals that we have signed up to and that we believe in. If you look at so if you want my opinion, what should happen is I think that the politicians should grow up and stop having trade wars about what's really quite a minor and young industry that, in fact, whose priority should be to drive down cost. If you look at Apple iPads, nobody suggests, nobody's having a trade war because they're manufactured in China, and yet solar panels, there is this trade tension around them. I think that what's going to happen, certainly in Europe, I would imagine that those tensions are actually going to lead to almost nothing, simply because the only place that makes solar panels on any scale in Europe is Germany, and Merkel has understood that it's not in Germany's interest to have a trade war over solar, which will then hit their machine tool exports and so on. So I think that one is going to simmer and die away. I couldn't comment on the US, what sort of, where that could go, but I think in any case, whatever the outcome of that trade, those trade disputes are, what you're not going to see is higher prices of solar panels or the resurgence of manufacturing capacity in solar, either in the US or in Europe, simply because there are so many other providers in Asia, whether it's Chinese companies moving production to Malaysia, or whether it's the Taiwanese, or whether it's Koreans, or whether it's production there are a number of other countries, and we are now living in a world of cheap solar. So, and that's just part of the sort of the new reality. So I think that in a sense the trade dispute is also, it sells newspapers or subscriptions to online news services or whatever, but it's actually not the major economic driver that I think it's being portrayed to be.
Michael, thank you very much with that. I think that we are going to stop here. We have some pointers for Columbia University to start developing on the reshare. And please join me to say thank you to the fantastic panel this afternoon.